Welcome to this journey into the forgotten corners of American history, where the line between hospitality and horror becomes terrifyingly blurred. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching this from? And what time is it there? Drop a comment below. There's something uniquely unsettling about exploring these stories in the quiet hours, when darkness mirrors the shadows of the past. Tonight, we travel to Missouri in the year 1897, to a stretch of lonely road where travelers once sought refuge and found something far more sinister than the cold night air they were escaping. This is the case that was deemed too dark for the public archives. This is the story of the Thornwell brothers. The final years of the 19th century were a time of transformation in America. The frontier was closing, railroads connected distant towns, and the modern age was dawning. Yet vast stretches of countryside remained isolated, connected only by unpaved roads that wound through endless forests and farmland. Travelers relied on the hospitality of strangers, a trust that was considered sacred in rural communities. In Blackwater Hollow, Missouri, a small settlement barely marked on county maps, two brothers maintained a modest homestead along the county road, the main artery connecting the railroad depot in Crestwood to the river ports near Jefferson City. Caleb and Ezra Thornwell were known throughout the region as generous hosts who offered weary travelers a warm meal and a safe bed for the night. For 15 years, their reputation remained unblemished, until the spring of 1897, when a young railroad inspector named Thomas Garrett accepted their invitation to supper and was never seen alive again. What began as a routine missing person inquiry would unravel into one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Missouri history. The discoveries made at the Thornwell property were so deeply troubling that county officials made the unprecedented decision to seal portions of the investigative files, deeming them unfit for public consumption. Some records remained sealed for over 80 years. The question that haunted investigators then and continues to disturb historians today is deceptively simple. What really happened to the travelers who stopped at the Thornwell homestead? The official count listed 17 confirmed victims. Unofficial estimates suggested the number could be 3 times higher. But numbers alone cannot capture the true horror of what was discovered in the spring and summer of 1897. The meticulous nature of the crimes, the strange symbols found throughout the property, the fragmentary diary entries that suggested motivations far more complex than simple robbery. All of these elements pointed to something darker than conventional murder. This is a story about trust betrayed, about the masks people wear, and about the secrets that rural America buried in its soil. This is a story that challenges our understanding of evil itself. The Thornwell case remains officially unsolved. The brothers disappeared before they could be tried. The complete truth died with them, leaving only fragments, theories, and the haunting question: were Caleb and Ezra Thornwell simply criminals, or were they part of something far more sinister? To understand the Thornwell case, we must first understand the world in which it unfolded. Missouri in the 1890s was a state caught between two eras. The devastating wounds of the Civil War, which had ended 3 decades earlier, still marked the landscape and the psyche of its people. Missouri had been a border state, torn between Union and Confederate loyalties, and neighbor had fought against neighbor in brutal guerrilla conflicts that left deep scars. The rural areas of central Missouri, where Blackwater Hollow was located, had been particularly affected. Communities were decimated, farms destroyed, and in the chaos that followed the war, many families simply disappeared. Record-keeping was inconsistent at best. In some counties, entire years of birth and death certificates were lost to fire, flood, or simple neglect. This created an environment where people could vanish without much official notice. Blackwater Hollow itself was barely a town. More accurately, it was a cluster of farms and homesteads spread across several square miles of rolling hills and dense oak forest. The settlement had no church, no school, no general store. The nearest established town, Crestwood, lay 12 miles to the east, connected by the county road that was little more than a rutted dirt path in dry weather and an impassable mud channel during rain. The Thornwell brothers had arrived in the area sometime around 1882. Records from that period are fragmentary, but property deeds show that Caleb Thornwell purchased 60 acres along the county road in March of that year. The price was remarkably low, suggesting the land had been abandoned or foreclosed. Local residents, interviewed decades later, remembered the brothers as quiet men who kept largely to themselves. They were not unfriendly, but they maintained a certain distance from community affairs. They attended no church, participated in no social gatherings, and rarely traveled to Crestwood except to purchase basic supplies. What made them notable, what gave them their reputation, was their hospitality to strangers. The county road was a well-traveled route. Salesmen moving between river ports and railroad depots, farmhands seeking seasonal work, families relocating to new homesteads, all of these travelers passed by the Thornwell property. The brothers made it known that they welcomed travelers, offering meals and lodging for a modest fee, or sometimes for free, if the traveler appeared particularly desperate. In an era when mutual assistance was a necessity of survival, this generosity was seen as admirable, even Christian, though the brothers professed no particular religious faith. A letter, written in 1889 by a traveling preacher named Reverend Marcus Holt, provides one of the few first-hand accounts of staying at the Thornwell homestead. The letter, discovered in church archives in 1963, describes a modest but well-maintained property with a sturdy two-story house and a large barn that seemed newer than the house itself. Reverend Holt wrote, "The brothers Thornwell received me with quiet courtesy. They asked few questions, which I found refreshing after so many inquiries about my mission and denomination. Supper was simple but adequate: beans, cornbread, and salt pork. The elder brother Caleb spoke little. The younger Ezra seemed more inclined to conversation, though his topics were peculiar. He asked whether I believed in redemption for all sins, or whether some acts placed a soul beyond salvation. I confessed uncertainty on such weighty theological matters. He nodded and said nothing more." The letter continues, "I was given a small room upstairs with a clean bed and a locked door, which I appreciated. I slept soundly and departed at dawn. The brothers accepted no payment, saying only that hospitality was a duty. As I left, I noticed Ezra watching me from the barn door, and I felt an unaccountable chill despite the warm morning. This letter would later take on a darker significance. Other testimonies exist, scattered through county records, personal diaries, and newspaper archives. A peddler named Simon Wexler mentioned the Thornwell property in his account book in 1891, noting that he had accepted supper but declined lodging, preferring to camp in the woods. He gave no explanation for this choice. A widow traveling to live with her daughter in Jefferson City wrote to her son in 1893, mentioning that she had stopped at a farmhouse where the two bachelor brothers seemed kind enough, though there was something about the younger one's eyes that troubled me. I left at first light. These small warning signs, these minor discomforts, reported by travelers, went unheeded. In isolated rural areas, eccentricity was common. The Thornwells were simply two more odd bachelors in a region full of hermits, widowers, and men scarred by war. No one suspected the truth. No one connected the occasional disappearances of travelers to the hospitable brothers along the county road. Until Thomas Garrett failed to arrive at his destination in April 1897, and his employer, the Missouri and Pacific Railroad, demanded a thorough investigation into His whereabouts. Thomas Garrett was 24 years old, the son of a railroad engineer, and employed as a junior track inspector for the Missouri and Pacific Line. His job required him to travel between depot stations, examining track conditions and reporting maintenance needs. On April 14, 1897, Garrett departed from the Crestwood Depot on horseback, carrying his inspection logs and personal effects. His route would take him along the county road toward Westport Junction, a journey of approximately 30 miles that he had completed many times before. He was expected to arrive in Westport Junction by evening of April 15th. He never arrived. When Garrett failed to report for duty on April 16th, his supervisor sent a telegram to the Crestwood station master, who confirmed that Garrett had departed as scheduled. A search party was organized immediately. The railroad took disappearances of its employees seriously, particularly in an era when accidents, robberies, and encounters with remaining outlaw gangs were genuine dangers. The search party, led by Deputy Sheriff Frank Morrison, began tracing Garrett's route along the county road. They found his first overnight campsite, marked by cold fire ash and horse droppings, approximately 8 miles west of Crestwood. This suggested Garrett had traveled through the afternoon of April 14th and made camp as darkness fell. Beyond this point, the trail became unclear. Spring rains had turned sections of the county road into mud, obscuring tracks. The search party questioned every homestead along the route. It was during these inquiries that Caleb Thornwell confirmed that Thomas Garrett had indeed stopped at their property on the evening of April 15th. According to Caleb's statement to Deputy Morrison, recorded in the official report, Garrett had arrived around supper time and had been invited to share a meal. "He seemed tired," Caleb stated. "His horse was lame. We offered him supper and suggested he might want to rest the animal overnight, but he declined, said he needed to make Westport Junction. He ate quickly and rode on. That was the last we saw of him." This account seemed reasonable. Deputy Morrison noted that Caleb appeared cooperative and concerned. The deputy and his search party continued westward, assuming Garrett must have encountered trouble somewhere between the Thornwell property and Westport Junction. They found his horse 3 days later, wandering loose near a creek 6 miles west of the Thornwell homestead. The animal was uninjured but still bore its saddle and saddlebags. Garrett's inspection logs were in the saddlebags, along with his personal effects: wallet, pocket watch, a letter from his mother. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. Thomas Garrett himself was nowhere to be found. The discovery of the horse transformed the case from a likely accident into a suspected crime. A man does not simply vanish while his horse, saddle, and valuables remain intact. Deputy Morrison expanded the search, bringing in additional men to comb the forests and ravines along the county road. They found nothing: no body, no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing. Thomas Garrett had simply ceased to exist somewhere along that lonely stretch of road. As the investigation continued, Deputy Morrison began to hear troubling whispers from local residents. A farmer named Jacob Hensley mentioned that his cousin, a drifter named William Hensley, had stopped at the Thornwell and property 2 years earlier and had never been heard from again. "But William was always moving around," Jacob said. "We figured he just moved on without writing. He wasn't much for letters." A woman in Crestwood recalled that her nephew, a young man seeking work in the Riverports, had mentioned planning to stop at those Bachelor Brothers' place in the autumn of 1895. He never reached the Riverports. The family had assumed he'd changed his plans or met with some accident. One by one, these casual mentions accumulated. A peddler who never returned to his family, a widow traveling to her daughter who never arrived, a pair of brothers seeking farmland out west who vanished somewhere between Crestwood and Jefferson City. None of these disappearances had seemed connected at the time. Travelers went missing on rural roads. It was an unfortunate reality of the era. Accidents happened. People drowned crossing swollen rivers, fell from horses, were bitten by snakes, succumbed to sudden illness. Drifters drifted. The rootless simply moved on. But now, with Thomas Garrett's disappearance, Deputy Morrison began to see a pattern. He returned to the Thornwell property on April 28, 1897, this time with 3 other deputies and a more pointed set of questions. The brothers maintained their story. Yes, Thomas Garrett had stopped for supper. No, he had not stayed the night. Yes, he had seemed in good health when he departed. No, they had not seen or heard anything unusual that evening. What about the others? Deputy Morrison asked, consulting his notes. William Hensley stopped here in 95. Mrs. Sarah Donovan, spring of 93. The Kirby brothers, summer of 94. Do you remember any of these people? According to Morrison's report, both brothers appeared momentarily unsettled by the question, though they quickly recovered their composure. Caleb responded that they had hosted many travelers over the years and could not possibly remember everyone. Some stayed, some just took a meal, some continued on their way. We run a respectable establishment, Ezra added. We've never harmed anyone who came to our door. Deputy Morrison could find no legal justification to search the property more thoroughly. No evidence of a crime had been discovered. The brother's account was plausible. Without more substantial cause, he could do nothing but leave with a warning that the investigation would continue. Now, I want to pause here and ask you, what do you think was really happening at the Thornwell homestead? Were the brothers simply unlucky, their property coincidentally on a route where travelers frequently met with accidents? Or was something far more sinister unfolding behind the facade of hospitality? Leave your theories in the comments below. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. On May 3, 1897, a travelling salesman named Otto Brenner arrived at the Thornwell property seeking lodging. The brothers welcomed him as they had welcomed countless others. But Otto Brenner carried something unusual, a nervous disposition and a small pistol, which he kept within reach even during supper. Years later, Brenner would tell investigators that something about the brothers had immediately unsettled him, though he could not articulate exactly what. It was the way they looked at me, he said, like a butcher sizing up a hog. After supper, the brothers offered Brenner a room in the upstairs of the house. He accepted, but once inside the room, he noticed something that filled him with dread, scratch marks on the inside of the door, as though someone had desperately tried to claw their way out. The door had a lock, but only on the outside. Brenner did not sleep. He sat with his back against the door and his pistol in his hand, waiting for dawn. Around midnight, he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his room. The doorknob turned slowly, testing, then stopped. At first light, Brenner left hastily, claiming a change in his travel plans. The brothers did not try to stop him, but as he rode away, he looked back to see both men watching from the porch, utterly still. Otto Brenner rode directly to Crestwood and reported his experience to Deputy Morrison. It was time to return to the Thornwell property with a warrant and a full search party. On May 5, 1897, Deputy Sheriff Frank Morrison arrived at the Thornwell property with a search warrant, 6 deputized men, and a grim sense of purpose. The warrant authorized a complete search of the house, barn, and surrounding grounds for evidence related to the disappearance of Thomas Garrett and other missing travelers. The brothers were not present. According to Morrison's detailed report, which was partially declassified in 1979, the property appeared abandoned. The front door of the house stood open, swinging slightly in the spring wind. Inside, the rooms showed signs of hasty departure. A table still set with breakfast dishes, a coat hanging on a peg, a fire burned down to cold ash in the stove. The searches began methodically. The downstairs rooms revealed nothing immediately suspicious. The house was modest but well maintained. A sitting room with 2 chairs and a small bookshelf. A kitchen with standard cookware and provisions. A pantry stocked with preserved goods. The upstairs contained 3 bedrooms. 2 were clearly occupied by the brothers, simple rooms with beds, wardrobes, and minimal personal effects. The 3rd room, the one where Otto Brenner had spent his terrifying night, was smaller and more austere. A bed, a single chair, a small table, and on the inside of the door, clearly visible in the daylight, the scratch marks Brenner had described. One of the deputies noticed something else. Dark stains on the floorboards near the bed. Stains that had been scrubbed but not entirely removed. They appeared to be blood. Morrison ordered the floorboards removed. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. The journal would later prove to be one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence ever entered into Missouri legal records. Written in a cramped, meticulous hand, it contained entries spanning from 1883 to early 1897. The handwriting analysis suggested it belonged to Ezra Thornwell, the younger brother. The early entries were mundane: weather observations, notes about crops and livestock, mentions of travelers passing through. But as the years progressed, the entries took on a darker character. An entry from October 1884 read, "Caleb says the work is necessary. The man who came Tuesday will serve the purpose. He has no family, no destination. No one will search for one who belongs nowhere." An entry from March 1886. 15 now. The cellar is nearly full. Caleb insists we must continue until the circle is complete. I ask how many more, but he cannot say, only that we will know when it is finished. An entry from July 1889. The preacher who stayed last night asked about redemption. Can there be redemption for what we do? Caleb says we are not seeking redemption, but transformation. I no longer understand the difference. The journal entries never explicitly described the murders, but they left little doubt about the brothers' guilt. More disturbingly, they suggested the killings were not motivated by robbery or simple madness, but by some deeper purpose that the writer himself seemed unable to fully articulate. Morrison and his deputies continued their search with increasing urgency and dread. The barn proved more immediately revealing. In a corner of the hayloft, hidden beneath loose boards, they discovered a large wooden trunk. Inside were personal effects, dozens of them. Pocket watches, wallets, jewelry, eyeglasses, small photographs, letters. Each item had been carefully preserved and labeled with a date. The earliest date was April 1883. The most recent was April 14th, 1897. Thomas Garrett's last day alive. Morrison counted 37 distinct sets of belongings, 37 travelers who had stopped at the Thornwell homestead and never left. The official report noted 17 confirmed victims, those whose families had reported them missing and whose belongings could be positively identified. But the remaining 20 sets of belongings suggested the true count was far higher. 20 people who had no one looking for them, no one to notice their absence. The cellar, mentioned in Ezra's journal, was discovered beneath the barn. Access through a concealed trapdoor, it was a crude excavation approximately 10 feet deep and 20 feet square, with earthen walls supported by timber beams. What Morrison and his men found there was not detailed in the public records. The official report stated only, human remains in various states of decomposition were discovered in the cellar space. Exact count pending examination by county coroner. The sealed portions of the file, later reviewed by historians, revealed more. The remains had been arranged deliberately, placed in specific positions around the perimeter of the cellar. Between them were symbols carved into the earthen floor, crude but systematic patterns that none of the investigators recognized. Some of the remains showed signs of trauma consistent with violence. Others appeared to have died from unknown causes, their bones intact but arranged as carefully as all the rest. The scene suggested ritual, not random murder. Purpose, not passion. But what purpose? What ritual? These questions would haunt the investigation for decades. As news of the discoveries at the Thornwell property spread, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A retired schoolteacher from Jefferson City named Eleanor Marsh contacted Deputy Morrison with information she believed might be relevant. Marsh had spent years researching local history and had become particularly interested in a religious sect called the Brethren of the New Covenant, which had briefly operated in central Missouri in the late 18th century, around 1785 to 1790. The sect, according to Marsh's research, had been founded by a charismatic preacher named Josiah Thornwell, who claimed to have received divine visions about the transformation of the human soul. The brethren believed that death was not an ending, but a doorway, and that through specific rituals, the living could facilitate the passage of souls to a higher state of existence. The connection to the Thornwell brothers was not merely the surname, though that alone was suggestive. Marsh had discovered a fragmentary document in the archives of the Jefferson City Historical Society, a letter written in 1789 by a colonial administrator describing the Brethren of the New Covenant as a dangerous congregation engaged in practices most foul, including the murder of travelers under the guise of spiritual transformation. The sect had been forcibly disbanded in 1790, its members scattered, its leader Josiah Thornwell executed for murder. But the beliefs had apparently survived, passed down through generations in secret. Marsh showed Morrison her research, including a sketch made by the colonial administrator of symbols found at the Brethren's meeting house. The symbols were nearly identical to those carved into the floor of the cellar beneath the Thornwell barn. Morrison's investigation expanded to include genealogical research, property records, birth certificates, family Bibles, anything that might establish a connection between Caleb and Ezra Thornwell and the long-dead Josiah Thornwell. The evidence was fragmentary but compelling. A family tree, painstakingly reconstructed, suggested that Caleb and Ezra were indeed descendants of Josiah Thornwell, through a line that had moved westward over the decades, from the original settlement in eastern Missouri to the isolated hills of Blackwater Hollow. Whether the brothers were consciously continuing their ancestors' work, or whether they had stumbled upon old family documents and embraced the dark legacy, remained unclear. Ezra's journal entries suggested some ambivalence. He questioned the purpose of the killings, even as he participated in them. But Caleb, the elder brother, appeared to be the driving force, the true believer. An entry from Ezra's journal, dated January 1895, provided chilling insight. Caleb showed me the old book last night, the one he keeps locked in the chest. It belonged to our great-great-grandfather, he says. The Covenant of Passage, written in his own hand. I read the words and felt both revulsion and strange exhilaration. Can this truly be our purpose? To serve as gatekeepers between worlds? Caleb insists that 33 is the sacred number, the same number that Josiah completed before the unbelievers stopped the work. We have 28, only 5 more, and the circle will be complete. 33 victims. The number chilled Morrison. If the journal was accurate, and if the brothers had achieved their goal, then they had surpassed even Josiah Thornwell's horrific legacy. But did the number 33 reflect reality, or was it a delusion? The 37 sets of belongings found in the barn suggested the brothers had exceeded their intended count, or perhaps they had miscounted, or perhaps the journal entry was simply the ravings of a disturbed mind trying to impose order on chaos. The historical connection to the Brethren of the New Covenant became a central element of the investigation. though it also introduced an element that made many officials uncomfortable. Was this case simply about two murderers, or was it about the persistence of dangerous ideology across generations? The local newspapers, which had been covering the case with increasing sensationalism, seized on the sectarian angle. Headlines screamed about blood cult murders and devil worshippers on the county road. The more sober reporting noted that the Brethren of the New Covenant had never claimed to worship any devil, but rather believed they were doing divine work. This distinction, however, mattered little to the terrified residents of Blackwater Hollow and surrounding communities. The Thornwell property became a site of macabre fascination and fear. Locals reported seeing strange lights in the windows at night, hearing sounds from the abandoned buildings, though these accounts were likely products of fear and imagination rather than genuine phenomena. Morrison posted guards at the property to prevent vandalism and to preserve evidence for the eventual trial of the Thornwell brothers when they could be found. The brothers themselves had vanished as completely as their victims. Despite an extensive manhunt involving multiple counties, no trace of Caleb or Ezra Thornwell was ever discovered. It was as if they had simply stepped off the edge of the world. The investigation continued throughout the summer of 1897, but without the brothers in custody, many questions remained unanswered. The coroner's examination of the remains found in the cellar confirmed that at least 19 individuals could be identified through skeletal analysis. Different heights, ages, both male and female. The condition of the remains varied, with some dating back over a decade and others much more recent. The cause of death could not be determined in most cases. A few skeletons showed signs of skull trauma, suggesting blunt force violence, but the majority showed no obvious injuries. Had these victims been poisoned, suffocated, or had they died from some cause that left no trace on bone? The disturbing possibility that some victims might have been buried alive was raised but never confirmed. The positioning of some remains, curled in fetal positions, arms raised as if pushing against something, suggested struggle, but this could also be explained by the natural process of decomposition in confined spaces. The symbols carved into the cellar floor remained a mystery. Eleanor Marsh's research provided a basic interpretation. The symbols represented stages of spiritual transformation, gateways through which souls were meant to pass. But the specifics of the ritual, how it was supposed to work, what the brothers actually did to their victims, remained unknown. Were the victims drugged and then killed in some painless way, their deaths meant to be peaceful transitions, or was suffering itself part of the ritual? Ezra's journal provided no clear answers, speaking only in abstract terms about the work and the passage. The most haunting aspect of the investigation was the realization that some victims might have been kept alive for days or weeks before being killed. The upstairs room with the scratched door, the bloodstains, the lock on the outside, all suggested that travelers were sometimes held prisoner. But for what purpose? Were the brothers waiting for specific dates to complete their ritual, or were they simply savoring their power over the captives? One detail that emerged from the investigation added another layer of horror. Among the belongings found in the barn trunk was a small leather notebook belonging to Thomas Garrett. Inside, he had recorded his inspection observations as usual, but the final entry, dated April 15th, was incomplete. It read, "Stopped at farmhouse for supper. Brothers seem hospitable but something wrong. Offered room for night but declined. Will continue to—" The sentence ended there, the pencil trailing off the page. Whatever had interrupted Garrett's writing had done so suddenly. Had he been writing in secret, sensing danger? Had the brothers discovered him recording his suspicions? Or had something else occurred at that moment? The notebook raised more questions than it answered, like so much else in this case. Deputy Morrison interviewed every resident within 20 miles of the Thornwell property, seeking any information about the brothers' movements, their habits, their associates. The picture that emerged was of two men who were simultaneously visible and invisible, known to everyone as the hospitable hosts on the county road, yet truly known to no one. They had no friends, no confidants, no connections to the community beyond commercial transactions. They purchased supplies in Crestwood, always paying in cash, always polite but never familiar. They had never been seen in the company of women, never attended any social gathering, never joined any civic organization. It was as if the hospitality they showed to travelers was not genuine warmth, but a carefully maintained facade, a lure designed for one specific purpose. But even this interpretation might be too simple. Ezra's journal entries sometimes expressed what seemed like genuine distress about the killings. He wrote of nightmares, of doubts, of wishing for a different path, yet he continued to participate. Was he a victim of his brother's stronger will, or was his apparent reluctance merely another layer of deception, even in his private writings? The investigation also sought to determine where the brothers had fled. Telegraph messages were sent to law enforcement across Missouri and neighboring states. Photographs of the brothers, taken from a family portrait found in the house, were circulated widely. The Missouri and Pacific Railroad, particularly invested in the case due to Thomas Garrett's death, offered a substantial reward for information leading to the capture of the Thornwell brothers. Several reported sightings came in. The brothers were spotted in Kansas City, in St. Louis, in Arkansas, in Illinois. None of these sightings were confirmed. Every lead evaporated upon investigation. It was as if the brothers had achieved in their own disappearance what they had inflicted on their victims: complete erasure from the world. The Thornwell property was eventually seized by the county and sold at auction. The house was torn down in 1899, the barn burned. The cellar was filled in and the ground blessed by a reluctant priest who performed the ceremony only after. Significant pressure from county officials, but the memory of what had occurred there could not be so easily erased. The case had shaken the community to its core, destroying the sense of security that rural hospitality had once provided. Travelers became more cautious. Homesteaders along lonely roads found that fewer people accepted their offers of shelter. Trust, once freely given, became a rare commodity. The Thornwell brothers had not just murdered their victims. They had murdered something more intangible, the belief in the fundamental goodness of strangers. The official investigation into the Thornwell murders closed in 1900 without resolution. The brothers were never found, dead or alive. The case was filed away, one more unsolved mystery in the criminal history of Missouri. But the story did not end there. Over the following decades, new fragments emerged, pieces of information that added layers to the mystery without ever fully solving it. In 1923, a construction crew working on road improvements near the old Thornwell property made a disturbing discovery. While excavating a drainage ditch approximately half a mile from where the house had stood, they unearthed a small metal box buried about 4 feet underground. The box contained bones, human bones, specifically the skeletal remains of a hand severed at the wrist. With the bones was a tarnished silver ring inscribed with the initials MK. The county sheriff at the time, too young to have direct memory of the Thornwell case, consulted the old case files. Among the list of suspected victims was Margaret Keller, a widow aged 43 who had disappeared in November 1892 while traveling from St. Louis to visit her sister in Jefferson City. Her family had reported her missing, noting that she wore a distinctive silver ring with her initials. Margaret Keller was one of the 17 confirmed victims, her belongings having been found in the Thornwell barn. But her remains had not been among those. discovered in the cellar. Now 3 decades later, a fragment of her had been found buried separately, far from the primary burial site. Why? What purpose did this separate burial serve? Was it part of the ritual described in Ezra's journal, or was it something else entirely? The discovery prompted a limited search of the surrounding area, but no other remains were found. The hand was buried in the Crestwood Cemetery with a small marker bearing Margaret Keller's name. In 1954, a more significant discovery occurred. A graduate student from the University of Missouri named Robert Chen was researching 19th-century religious movements in the state. While examining documents in the basement archives of the Jefferson City Courthouse, he discovered a sealed box marked Thornwell Evidence, Restricted. The box had been mislabeled and misfiled, apparently forgotten during a records reorganization in the 1920s. Inside were materials that had been excluded from the public case files, additional pages from Ezra Thornwell's journal, letters between the brothers, and several drawings. Chen, working with university legal advisors and eventually gaining court permission to examine the materials, discovered that the full journal was far more extensive than previously known. The pages that had been publicly released represented perhaps 1/3 of the complete document. The additional entries revealed new information about the brothers' psychological states and their relationship. It became clear that Caleb was indeed the dominant personality, the true believer in their inherited mission. But the extended journal also revealed that Ezra had made at least 2 attempts to abandon the work. An entry from June 1890 described Ezra leaving the property with the intention of never returning. He traveled as far as Kansas City and began seeking employment, hoping to start a new life. But he returned after 3 weeks. The journal entry explaining his return was cryptic. "I tried to leave, but the dreams followed me. Every night I saw their faces, not angry, not accusing, but waiting for me to complete what was begun. Caleb was right. We cannot walk away from our purpose. It walks with us." Another entry from 1894 described Ezra's consideration of confessing to the authorities. "If I told them everything, would that end it? Or would the confession simply be another form of vanity, a desire to be seen and judged? Caleb says the world is not meant to judge us. There is a higher judgment, and we will face it when the circle is complete." These entries painted a picture of Ezra as psychologically trapped, unable to break free from his brother's influence and his own disturbing belief that the murders served some transcendent purpose. The drawings found in the box were perhaps the most unsettling discovery. They depicted the cellar, but not as it appeared in reality. Instead, the drawings showed the cellar as a kind of threshold, a doorway, with figures passing through into a space beyond, a space that Ezra represented with swirling lines and abstract symbols. Whether these drawings represented genuine spiritual belief or the delusions of a disturbed mind was a matter of interpretation. Chen, in his subsequent doctoral dissertation on the Thornwell case, argued that the brothers suffered from what he termed inherited delusional disorder, a shared psychosis passed down through family mythology and reinforced by isolation. Other scholars disagreed, arguing that the brothers' beliefs were coherent within the framework of certain esoteric religious traditions, even if their actions were criminal and horrific. In 1968, an elderly woman named Ruth Morrison, daughter of the original investigating officer Frank Morrison, contacted the Missouri Historical Society with a personal account. Her father, before his death in 1931, had shared with her details about the case that had never been made public. According to Ruth Morrison's account, her father had privately believed that the Thornwell brothers never left the property at all. He thought they had killed themselves, a murder-suicide that completed their ritual in some final, unknown way. Frank Morrison had supposedly returned to the property multiple times after the official investigation closed, conducting his own searches. He believed there was another cellar, a second hidden space that had never been discovered, where the brothers might have buried themselves as the 34th and 35th victims of their own design. He never found this hypothetical second cellar, but he remained convinced of its existence until his death. Ruth Morrison donated her father's personal notes on the case to the Historical Society, providing researchers with new insight into the investigation. But whether Frank Morrison's theory was based on evidence or simply represented his own need for closure remained unclear. The most recent addition to the Thornwell mystery came in 1983, when a metal detector enthusiast named David Palmer discovered a buried metal container while searching the woods near the old property site. The container held a water-damaged book, the Covenant of Passage mentioned in Ezra's journal. The book, which was extensively damaged but partially legible, appeared to be a handwritten manuscript dating from the late 18th century. It was written in an archaic English style and outlined a theological framework that justified murder as a form of spiritual transformation. The author, presumably Josiah Thornwell, claimed that certain souls were meant to pass through death, administered by chosen gatekeepers who would facilitate their transition to a higher plane of existence. The ritual required specific numbers, specific positioning, specific symbols, all matching what had been found in the Thornwell cellar. The book was donated to the Missouri State Archives, where it remains to this day, a disturbing artifact of a belief system that led to generations of horror. Each of these discoveries, spread across decades, added pieces to the puzzle without ever completing the picture. The Thornwell case remained fundamentally unsolved, not because the guilt of the brothers was in doubt, but because so much about their motivations, their ultimate fate, and the full extent of their crimes remained unknown. More than a century has passed since Deputy Frank Morrison first walked through the open door of the Thornwell homestead and into one of the darkest chapters of American criminal history. The brothers who welcomed travelers along the county road have long since passed from living memory into legend and nightmare. But the questions remain. What truly motivated Caleb and Ezra Thornwell? Were they continuing an inherited tradition of ritual murder, as the evidence of the Brethren of the New Covenant suggests? Or did they simply use religious justification to mask more primal urges toward violence and control? The historical record offers no definitive answer, only theories that attempt to impose order on what may ultimately be incomprehensible. Theory 1. The true believers. This interpretation holds that the brothers genuinely believed in their mission as gatekeepers, facilitating spiritual transformation. They were not sadists or common criminals, but religious zealots following a doctrine inherited across generations. Their victims were not random, but selected according to criteria mentioned but never fully explained. In Ezra's journal, travelers with no strong ties, no one who would search persistently, people who in the brothers' deluded theology were ready for passage. This theory is supported by the methodical nature of the crimes, the ritual elements, and Ezra's journal entries expressing doubt not about whether the work should be done, but about whether he understood its ultimate purpose. Theory 2. The folie à deux. This psychological interpretation suggests that Caleb was a dominant psychopath who created an elaborate religious framework to justify his compulsion to kill. Ezra, psychologically dependent and unable to resist his older brother's influence, became trapped in a shared delusion. The journal entries showing Ezra's attempts to leave and his recurring doubts support this theory. Without Caleb, Ezra might never have killed anyone, but under his brother's influence, he became a willing participant in atrocities he questioned but could not resist. Theory 3. The hidden truth A. Minority of researchers have suggested that the full story of the Thornwell case was never revealed. They point to the sealed records, the persistent rumors of additional victims, and Deputy Morrison's conviction that something important remained undiscovered. This theory proposes that the brothers might have been part of a larger network, that the Brethren of the New Covenant might have had other members in other locations, and that the case we know represents only a fragment of a more extensive criminal conspiracy. The brothers' successful disappearance, according to this theory, might have been facilitated by co-conspirators who helped them escape justice. However, no evidence has ever emerged to support this theory beyond speculation and the uncomfortable feeling that too much remains unexplained. The truth is likely some combination of these theories, or perhaps something none of them capture. Human evil rarely fits neatly into categories. The Thornwell brothers were complex individuals driven by a mixture of belief, compulsion, and circumstances that created the perfect environment for their crimes. What we can say with certainty is this: between 1883 and 1897, at least 17 people, and possibly more than 30, accepted the hospitality of two brothers on a lonely stretch of road in Missouri and never left. Their trust was betrayed in the most fundamental way imaginable. They became not just victims of murder, but victims of a systematic program of killing that their murderers believed served a higher purpose. The case was deemed too dark for full public disclosure, and perhaps rightly so. Some details of what was found at the Thornwell property remain sealed even today, considered too disturbing for general release. But the sealed records cannot contain the impact of the case. The Thornwell murders changed how rural Americans viewed strangers, how they assessed danger, how they balanced hospitality against caution. Trust became more tentative. The road became more dangerous, not because of the brothers themselves, but because of the awareness they created that evil could wear a mask of kindness. To this day, locals in the area that was once Blackwater Hollow report an uneasiness about the stretch of road where the Thornwell property once stood. Whether this is genuine intuition or simply the power of dark history to color perception is impossible to say. The Thornwell brothers themselves remain ghosts, never found, never buried, never brought to justice. Their disappearance is perhaps the final cruelty of this case, denying closure to the families of their victims and leaving the story forever incomplete. Some believe they died in their flight, succumbing to exposure or accident in the wilderness. Others believe they successfully escaped and lived out their lives under assumed names in some distant place. And a few, like Deputy Frank Morrison, believe they never truly left at all, but completed their dark ritual. In a way we will never fully understand. The case file remains open, technically unsolved, waiting for the discovery that will never come. This has been the story of the Thornwell brothers, the case too dark for the archives, and the travelers who sought shelter and found only darkness. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about the nature of evil, the fragility of trust, or the mysteries that still haunt our history, please let us know in the comments. Share your theories, your thoughts, your own knowledge of forgotten cases like this one. And if you want to continue exploring these dark corners of history with us, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. Join our community of those who seek truth in shadow, who remember the forgotten, and who refuse to let these stories disappear into the darkness that created them. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, not all doors should be opened, and not all hospitality should be accepted. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. I'll see you in the next investigation.